She waited for 70 years, but only met him once. When she found out that the man in front of her was her first love 60 years ago, she went straight to the man without paying attention to other people's eyes, put a pocket watch in his hand, and then said with deep affection, "Come back to me." Richard was at a loss, but before he could ask what was going on, the woman had already turned around and left. Although he didn't know the other party, Richard felt a little uneasy when he saw the lonely figure of the woman leaving resolutely. The sadness of the name, but he soon pulled his thoughts back to the cheerful graduation atmosphere. The woman who left was now in tears, as if she had fulfilled her lifelong wish. After returning home, she first locked herself in the room silently. Then she opened the curtains and looked at the calm lake outside the window. Then, in the sound of her favorite music, she gently stroked Richard's unpublished work. Then she hugged the work in her arms like hugging a lover and passed away peacefully that night. In the blink of an eye, 8 years have passed in a flash. Richard, who was once young and ignorant, has become a famous screenwriter with his unremitting efforts and persistence. The script in the old woman's hand has already made him famous, but success has not made him lose his way. He still has the dream of writing the best stage script in the world. He longs to engrave his name in the Hall of Honor of the screenwriter world, but it is not so easy to realize his dream. The lack of inspiration recently made it difficult for him to complete the creation of the new script, which made him feel frustrated. So he simply packed some luggage and planned to go on a trip. However, just after arriving at the TV station, at the stairs, he met his boss who came to urge him to submit his manuscript. He did not argue with him, but got into his sports car. Little did he know that it was this temporary decision that made the gears of his fate start to turn. After driving on the road for a while, Richard was inexplicably attracted by a hotel, so he drove in. When checking in, he met a white-haired old man. He learned that his name was Arthur. He came here to work with his father when he was 5 years old. Now it has been 70 years. He has lived and worked here all his life, and claims to know everything here. At first, Arthur just said some polite words, but when he sent Richard to the room and was about to leave, he suddenly seemed to realize something. Then he abruptly asked if we had met before. Since it was the first time to come to this hotel, Richard immediately said that he definitely hadn't. Arthur realized his abruptness after hearing this, so he apologized and quickly left the room. Richard, who was bored, took out the pocket watch given by the old lady 8 years ago and looked at the time. Realizing that it was almost time for dinner, he went downstairs to the restaurant, but he was told that it would open in 40 minutes, and he was bored and idle. He came to the hotel museum next door, intending to kill some time here. There are many century-old objects on display here. When Richard carefully observed them, he felt that someone was watching him from behind. He couldn't help but turn around and found that the source of his gaze was a portrait of a beautiful woman. The woman seemed to have been waiting for Richard for a long time, so when he approached unconsciously, the light around him was reflected incomparably dazzling. The woman was so beautiful that Richard could never forget her at a glance. But when he looked at the bottom of the album, he found that without any information about the woman, Richard eagerly sought help from Arthur, hoping to get clues from this knowledgeable old man. Arthur's story seemed like a key that opened the door of dusty memories. It turned out that the woman's name was McKenna, a popular drama actress of that era. In 1912, she performed in the theater of this hotel. Later, for some reason, she spent a huge amount of money to acquire the hotel, so her portrait was hung for a long time, despite the age difference of several dozen years, and the fact that he didn't know whether she was still alive. But Richard was still hopelessly fascinated. He fell in love with McKenna, and even for the next few days, he felt like he had lost his soul and couldn't sleep or eat. Finally, he couldn't suppress his inner impulse and drove to the nearby library to find more traces of McKenna. However, even if he looked through all the materials, he couldn't find more information about McKenna. Just when he was at a loss, the librarian came like a god and sent him several rare theater biographies, and one of them happened to be McKenna's autobiography. But when Richard opened it with great joy, a photo that caught his eye made him dumbfounded. Because that person was clearly the woman who gave him the pocket watch inexplicably. 8 years ago, Richard was confused and puzzled at the same time. In order to solve the mystery and find out the truth, he found the writer of the magazine according to the clues, but when the other party learned his purpose, he had no intention of receiving him. Until he showed the exquisite pocket watch, it turned out that this pocket watch was McKenna's personal belongings, but for some reason, on the night of McKenna's death, this pocket watch also mysteriously disappeared. Richard was shocked to learn the truth. He didn't expect McKenna to have passed away, and even more, Unexpectedly, McKenna died the night he received the pocket watch. The writer seemed to sense Richard's emotions, so he quickly invited him into the house and then showed him his collection of theater props and McKenna's personal belongings. Looking at the room full of things used by his dream lover, Richard suddenly became curious about what kind of person McKenna was. After hearing this, the writer said with a little regret that she was smart, sharp, lively, and cheerful when she was young. But after a performance in a hotel in 1912, she suddenly became empty, lonely, and depressed, as if she had endless worries. At first, Richard didn't notice anything unusual and didn't delve into why McKenna's personality changed so drastically, until he found out that the music box McKenna collected was the model of the hotel he was staying in now. What made him even more incredible was that the music in the music box was his favorite song, and even the book McKenna read repeatedly during his lifetime was written by his philosophy professor during his college years. It seemed that everything in this room was closely related to him, but what Richard found most incredible was the book McKenna read repeatedly during his lifetime. It was about time travel. After receiving this news, Richard immediately found the philosophy professor, hoping to learn more information about time travel. The professor told him about his own time travel experience. That day, he lived in an old room, where everything was old furnishings, without any modern products. He held the coins of that year and kept honing the time of that year. As a result, he really went back to that time. After returning, he became exhausted and sweaty. But since then, he has tried again countless times, but never had the experience of time travel again. Hearing this, Richard began to be eager to try. After all, the old hotel meets all the conditions for building an old house. After making up his mind, he first went to an antique shop to buy some coins circulating in 1912. Then he returned to the hotel room and dressed himself up like a male model in a magazine in 1912. Richard then used a tape recorder to record his thoughts of traveling to 1912, put away all the modern items in the room, and lay on the bed, repeatedly listening to his own recordings to try to hypnotize himself. However, no matter how hard he tried to concentrate, he couldn't complete the desired travel. The deep frustration made him collapse for a time. He could only come to the hotel museum again to admire McKenna's peerless beauty repeatedly. Suddenly, a hotel guest record in the display cabinet inexplicably attracted his attention, and then he rushed to find and wake up like crazy. Arthur was sleeping soundly. Richard wanted to know if the hotel still had the information of the guests in 1912. When he learned that all the old items were stored in the attic, Richard immediately took a flashlight to the dusty attic. Unexpectedly, he really found the records of that year. It clearly recorded McKenna's check-in time and room number. When he was about to check the next page, he closed his eyes and dared not look again. Unexpectedly, he also saw his check-in information and room number. This means that he did meet McKenna before. With this information, Richard was more determined to return to the room again, preparing to travel through time. This time he also hid the recorder under the bed, then held his breath and concentrated his mind, thinking only about the time and place of travel. Gradually, he fell asleep, and then the curtains of the hotel began to change constantly. When Richard woke up again, he found that everything around him was very different from before. Even Richard couldn't believe that he really successfully traveled through time. However, before he could be happy, a woman's voice came from behind him. In order not to be discovered, he hurriedly hid behind the curtains, but the next second, he opened a gap to check. Unexpectedly, he traveled to someone else's room. Looking at the other person's clothes and appearance, he was more certain that he had traveled through time, successful things. In order to avoid unnecessary trouble, he had to leave the room quickly and quietly, while the other party was not paying attention. The sudden sound of the door closing still attracted the man's attention. After leaving the room, he hurriedly pretended to pass by the door, which successfully dispelled the man's suspicion. Then he found the room where McKenna stayed, based on the guest records he checked that night. However, it was McKenna's maid who opened the door. The maid thought Richard was just an ordinary fan, so she closed the door without revealing any information. Richard, who had no clue, could only come to the lobby to try his luck. He didn't expect that the hotel business was so popular that year. Everyone's face was full of smiles, as if there was no sorrow in life. Richard was also deeply moved and smiled happily. But at this moment, a ball suddenly fell into his arms. What surprised him even more was that the little boy in front of him was Arthur in his childhood. It turned out that the two had really met somewhere, as the old Arthur said. Thinking of this, Richard recalled what the old Arthur said. There was a theater in the hotel in 1912, and the time he chose to travel through was the days when McKenna performed. In order to see the long-awaited McKenna as soon as possible, He went directly to the theater to ask around for news about McKenna, but everyone still treated him as an ordinary fanatic and ignored his questions. Since he couldn't get any information here, Richard ran to the backstage and planned to knock on the doors of the dressing rooms one by one. Unexpectedly, he ran into a thirsty old lady who was delighted to see the fat lady delivered to her door. Fortunately, Richard reacted quickly enough to not only save his body, but also get important information. It turned out that McKenna was walking by the lake at this time. After getting this news, Richard immediately went to the lake excitedly. Sure enough, he saw a lonely but beautiful figure pacing and wandering in the mottled light and shadow. Before they actually met, Richard had predicted countless times the scenes and pictures of their meeting. He even imagined many topics to talk about and emotions to express. But when he really met McKenna face to face, he was so nervous that he couldn't say a word and could only feel his heart beating wildly. In the end, it was McKenna who broke the silence and whispered, "Is it you?" He was suddenly shocked after hearing it. Was McKenna also waiting for him? Before he could ask, their conversation was interrupted by McKenna's agent. The agent was a typical control freak and would never allow any strange man to appear around McKenna. So he was full of vigilance and hostility towards Richard, who suddenly appeared. However, McKenna seemed to have sensed something. She ignored the warning of her agent and turned back to check on Richard, who followed her. In order to see McKenna again, Richard sneaked into the hotel's ballroom that night and was lucky enough to meet McKenna, who was dancing with someone else again. He just used a little trick to come to McKenna, hoping to dance with McKenna. At first, McKenna struggled to refuse Richard's physical contact on the grounds that they had never met before, but soon she was attracted by Richard's deep affection and accepted the invitation with trepidation and excitement. But just when the two were immersed in the subtle relationship, the agent suddenly appeared again and brought the hotel security to ask Richard to leave here quickly. Watching Richard leave as if he had felt something, McKenna for the first time, he followed him against his agent's will, but the two did not walk far, but stood at the door for a brief conversation. After introducing his name and occupation, Richard wanted to know why McKenna blurted out, "Is it you?" when they first met. But McKenna answered with silence. Richard wanted to know when they could meet again, but the agent was already watching him from a distance. Therefore, McKenna did not dare to stay for long and hurriedly said goodbye to Richard and returned to the world of fame and fortune. Richard thought he had no chance. He hid in a corner alone, feeling sad, but he did not know that McKenna also had a good impression of him, and even at night he was still reminiscing about it. The two had a brief, intimate interaction during the day, but at this time, the agent appeared again at an inappropriate time and reminded McKenna to control her emotions. Especially tomorrow night's performance must be, there could be no mistakes. With the sound of birds chirping, Richard, who had not yet checked in, woke up from the sofa in the corridor. Richard took out his pocket watch and checked the time. He immediately tidied up his appearance and came to the door of McKenna's room to invite his sweetheart to have breakfast together. Fortunately, the maid had not gotten up yet, and it was McKenna who opened the door. However, McKenna did instinctively reject his kindness. But Richard did not intend to give up. He retreated first and said that they could have breakfast or lunch together. If not, they could take a walk together. During the conversation, Richard not only expressed his sincerity while the iron was hot, but also grabbed McKenna's hand at the right time. Faced with his persistence and fear that the maid in the house would be awakened, McKenna, who had already had a good impression of him, had to agree to take a walk in the afternoon. After agreeing on the time and place, Richard came check in at the hotel front desk, and the reason why he delayed until now was to leave the same information he had seen in the registration book. Although there were some minor incidents in the middle, fortunately, everything went smoothly in the end. However, just when he was about to go back to the room, he saw little Arthur sobbing beside him. Richard knew that he must have been criticized for playing ball in the lobby, so he stole the ball from the front desk when no one was paying attention, and then handed it to the little guy who was crying and gently stroked and comforted Arthur. After lunch, Richard met McKenna as scheduled, but the agent also followed quietly to avoid being disturbed by the agent again. They quickly jumped into a carriage while the agent was not paying attention, and drove away with the agent's unhappy face. Then they came to the lake far away from the hotel. The sun was bright here, and the scenery was pleasant. The two of them got along very sweetly, just like a couple in love. As Richard talked endlessly, when talking about her work, McKenna just stared at his face in a daze. This time, McKenna finally opened her heart and explained why she suddenly said, "Is it you?" when they first met. It turned out that the agent had predicted that a man would appear in McKenna's life, but this man was a terrible existence. Not only would he hinder McKenna's career development, but he would even destroy her life. It was because of this that McKenna always subconsciously rejected Richard at the beginning. But after spending a day together, she felt that Richard was not terrible at all, and it was impossible for him to bring misfortune to her life, as the so-called prophecy said. After untying the knot between them, the two went boating on the lake together. Perhaps because he was too excited, Richard couldn't help humming his favorite song. McKenna felt that it sounded very pleasant. When she learned that it was a masterpiece of a certain master, McKenna was a little incredible, because she knew the master, and he did not compose this song. However, what she didn't know was that the master hadn't created anything yet. After the two of them spent a pleasant afternoon together, McKenna wanted to go back to her room to rest and gather her energy for the evening performance. But Richard was like a clingy puppy, and strongly demanded to go to the room to communicate. McKenna had no choice but to compromise. In fact, the two people who had a good impression of each other knew what would happen next. But when Richard leaned over, McKenna was still shaking with nervousness, but the next second, her nervousness turned into panic, because the agent came to make a surprise attack again and again. McKenna, who was gentle in nature, also got angry. For the first time, she resisted the excessive control of the agent like an independent individual. Not only that, she also gave Richard a personal performance ticket in front of the agent, inviting him to come to the scene no matter what. As the beautiful music echoed in the theater, the stage play starring McKenna officially kicked off. Richard sat in the audience and followed the heroine on the stage closely. I have to say that McKenna's performance is impeccable. From the precise lines to the delicate micro-expressions, it is amazing. However, when the plot reached the climax, McKenna suddenly changed the lines privately. The original evaluation of the characters in the play became a veiled confession to Richard. This operation directly made all the staff panic, and the agent was so nervous that he stood up directly. Even the actors who performed on the same stage were shocked by her. She didn't know how to deal with it, so she could only stare at the staff on both sides for help. However, McKenna still expressed his thoughts slowly, and I couldn't help but feel a little surprised. I can't describe my feelings for you in words, except for this sentence: I really love you. Just when all the staff thought that the performance was going to fail, the audience felt the true feelings and burst into warm applause. When the whole performance ended perfectly, McKenna was called backstage to take photos for publicity. However, no matter how the photographer guided her, she couldn't give a suitable smile. When Richard walked in front of her, she immediately raised her mouth and smiled. A look froze the time. A smile amazed the years. At this time, Richard also realized that the beautiful photo that haunted him was because of his appearance. Born Richard, who knew the truth, fell into sweetness. But at this moment, he suddenly received a letter from his agent for an appointment. Since the letter said it was a serious matter, he came to the appointment place without hesitation. The agent had obviously been waiting for a long time, so when he saw Richard, he expressed his inner thoughts in a fierce manner. It turned out that he had trained McKenna for more than 10 years. He believed that McKenna would become a top star with great achievements under his training, and he would definitely go down in history. But now Richard's appearance might disrupt all this, so he strongly asked Richard to leave McKenna as soon as possible. In the past, Richard always thought that the agent's possessiveness of McKenna was the lust of a man for a woman. Now Richard understands that it is the agent's ambition to make him famous by creating the ultimate product. Richard sincerely apologized for his self-judgment, but at the same time he said that he would never leave because he really loved McKenna and wanted to accompany McKenna for the rest of his life. The agent saw that the other party insisted on refusing to accept the kind advice, and the agent immediately ordered his men to take Richard away. A severe lesson. At the same time, McKenna, who had finished the performance, began to look for Richard everywhere. Seeing her anxious appearance, the agent told her that Richard had left and would never come back. Seeing the agent's attitude, McKenna instantly understood everything. This time, she finally bravely said her inner thoughts: "Your prediction is wrong. He will definitely make me happy." McKenna said, "I don't believe he just left without saying goodbye." After searching everywhere without success, she came to Richard's room again. Until the staff reminded her that she had to leave for the next performance, McKenna reluctantly left Richard's room. The next day, when the sun shone on his forehead, Richard woke up from the dimness of the stable. It turned out that he was tied up and thrown into the stable after being beaten last night. After Richard broke free from the restraints on his body, he couldn't wait to come to McKenna's room, but no matter how he knocked on the door, he didn't get any response. The front desk clerk saw it and told him with regret that McKenna's troupe had left after the performance last night. Richard was completely in despair. He seemed to feel he remembered the heart-wrenching love that McKenna had in his later years. However, just when he was in despair, he suddenly heard McKenna's cry from afar. It turned out that McKenna would rather break up with her agent and lose her glamorous job, and resolutely chose to stay. Because she firmly believed that Richard would not let her down, a love spanning 70 years of time and space finally ushered in an intersecting end. The two people who were deeply in love also concluded a good marriage in the green gauze eyeshadow. For several days afterwards, they stayed in the hotel every day, talking about dreams and sharing the past with each other. But the happier they were, the more they were happy. The more you live, the more likely you are to encounter unexpected events. The two talked about getting married that day. McKenna felt that Richard's suit was an old style that was popular 15 years ago and was not suitable as a groom's suit at all. But Richard arrogantly thought that this suit not only showed his figure, but also had many practical pockets. After that, Richard took out a coin to show off, but unexpectedly found that the year on it had changed from 1912 to 1979. Suddenly, Richard remembered what his mentor said, that time travel would eventually stop. But before he could say goodbye, he was pulled away from this world by an invisible force. Only McKenna was left, holding the golden pocket watch that he had not taken away in time, calling his name heartbreakingly. When Richard opened his eyes again, he found himself lying on the cold floor. His whole back was wet, and everything around him returned to the modern appearance. Reluctant, he hurriedly climbed back to bed, eager to return to the world with McKenna. But no matter how hard he tried, he could never succeed again. Since then, Richard has become silent, no longer working or socializing, and only willing to wander around the museum where McKenna's photos are hidden, or standing in a daze on the beach where the two first met, when his friends took the initiative to find him. His eyes were dull and his face was pale. It turned out that he had been without water and food for 7 days. The doctor hurriedly carried out desperate rescue, and soon Richard showed a happy smile because he finally saw the figure that haunted him again. And the two people who loved each other, also died in the third time and space, continued their unfinished love. Back in Time 70 Years is directed by Gino Terzwark, starring Christopher Reeve and Jane Seymour. It was released in 1980. Just a glance at the photo of McKenna Richard made him inexplicably obsessed with her. When he learned that there was a 70-year time gap between the two, he not only did not give up the search, but with a pious heart, traveled back to the era of young McKenna, and the two had a fantasy love across time and space. Unfortunately, time travel is like a dream that will eventually wake up, and Richard eventually died of depression because he could not see his lover again. Richard's persistence in love makes people cry, but McKenna's hopeless waiting is even more heartbreaking. Well, today's movie sharing is here. Welcome to like, comment, and forward. Thank you for your patience. Looking forward to meeting you next time.